Hi, everybody. Welcome to this Friday in June. I have an amazing guest with me today, my friend, Judge Ginger Lerner-Wren. She was elected the Broward County Court Judge in 1997. Judge Lerner-Wren pioneered the first mental health court in the United States. This court is dedicated to the decriminalization of persons arrested with mental illness and co-occurring disorders. She's also on the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, which is where I met her. She is an adjunct professor for Nova Southeastern University and the author of a new book called A Court of Refuge, Stories from the Bench of America's First Mental Health Court. Judge Lerner-Wren, it's so nice to have you with me today.
Hey, I'm absolutely delighted, and it is such a privilege.
Yeah, we clicked. I think the first time we met at one of the Action Alliance meetings, you just were so enthusiastic about what you do, so passionate about caring for people with mental illness, using your position as a judge to do something different for people living with mental illness who find themselves in the legal system. So probably not everybody knows what the mental health court is, but before you do that, just give us just a brief, the quick bio of who you are.
Thank
you. Of your life.
I will. I'll be brief, but first of all, I just wanted to apologize. I'm not coming from my office in the courthouse because we don't have a camera set up there. So I'm literally in my living room.
Makes it feel nice and cozy. That's great.
It does. My judicial assistant actually might walk in in just a few minutes, but we're in Fort Lauderdale. I am a Broward County Court judge, and for your audience who may not know where that is, I'm in Fort Lauderdale, about 35 minutes north of Miami. And I've been on the bench now, believe it or not, I can't believe it. It's like over 20 years now.
Yeah.
And I come out of really the public interest health field in a sense of doing disability rights work. I'm a former public guardian. And then I was doing very specific work overseeing a federal class action for what is now Disability Rights Florida, with regards to our regional state psychiatric hospital on behalf of the residents, on behalf of the patients. A very unusual, quite frankly, at the time, controversial consent decree, but I came to the judiciary with all kinds of specialized training and skills at the time when our legal system was really looking to problem solve what was happening to people being arrested with mental illness.
Well, one of the things that I think, just as we start off, is that probably most people don't realize that that jails are the largest mental health provider in our nation. We think this hospital system provides mental health care, or, there's this state hospital or whatever, but actually talk to us about that. How have jails become our largest provider?
It's really a tragedy. But, we came to a place in the 1950s and 60s, and it really was President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, that laid out a beautiful vision for community mental health in 1963. And then as the story, and it's actually in the book, he was assassinated 1 month after signing the legislation. And with that vacuum of leadership out of the executive branch, all of that beautiful vision of a new era, moving away from asylums. I don't have to tell you, there's so many, stories about, what kind of horrible abusive conditions those were. And so the Community Mental Health Act never did come to fruition. Instead, civil rights laws were put in place, and a deinstitutionalization movement, was upon us, and yet we just didn't have the infrastructure. We didn't have the mental health centers, rehab centers, array of housing, just weren't prepared. And so we saw people literally moving out of one inappropriate type of system of psychiatric state hospitals into what became the jail systems and prison systems in our country, serving as de facto hospitals. And as we speak, an estimated 400,000 people are behind bars in our country with serious mental illnesses and other intellectual disabilities. And it really is, a horrible, horrible situation that really, in my view, is not necessary.
Yeah, I think that was one of the most shocking pieces of information when I became a mental health advocate after the death of our son, Matthew. And as I began to learn, I'd really mostly known about mental illness just as it related to our family, our situation. Matthew was not in the legal system other than police would come to his house and take him to the mental health facility sometime, which was horrible in and of itself. And it's just such a painful memory, but he was not arrested for any crime. So we weren't engaged in that. So when I learned how many hundreds of thousands of mentally ill people are in the jail and prison system, and it's disproportionate to people of color too. So it's
absolutely
becomes such a justice issue.
It is. It conflates right into, the whole idea of really we have an obligation, a moral obligation, an ethical obligation, a legal obligation, to reduce incarceration, of course. And but I was just thinking when you were saying how shocked you were, I was just as shocked. Huh. They don't teach us that in law school. Huh. I learned it through my jobs, my various roles after I graduated from high school. And I tell you, the first thought that came into my head is, how could this be? Not in America.
Right.
Not in America.
Right.
And so to be able then to plug those skills in to a specialized court was really a blessing.
Well, and that takes us right to tell us about that's one of the wonderful parts of your biography, is that you've gotten to be a part of the very first mental health court in the United States. So first of all, for anybody not familiar, what is a mental health court? How is that different than a criminal court? And then we'll talk more about that. But first of all, just what is it? What's by definition?
Absolutely. Mental health court is a problem-solving treatment court. It really is part of that evolutionary track. We saw the very first drug court, ironically in Miami-Dade in 1989. And very simply, these are courts that are not adversarial. They're voluntary. They offer treatment over punishment. And they should be, I hope, applying an incredible, powerful law reform science with a very big name. It's therapeutic. I can't even say it. It's therapeutic jurisprudence. Mm-hmm. We call it TJ. Yeah. But the idea is that we take the rule of law and we add to it, if you will, a different style of judging, one that allows storytelling. And we really want to be strength-based. We want to be encouraging, and we want to be educative in terms of how important treatment is, and that recovery, treatment works and recovery is real. So problem-solving courts are meant to solve vexing problems that literally fall on the doorsteps of the legal system, often due to lack of resources or gaps in policy.
So I think that was 1997. Was
1997? Yeah, about this week. Yeah. In 1997, we're turning 21 years old this week.
So at that moment, you didn't really know what you were getting into. You had been a judge in the criminal system, right?
For about 4 months.
Okay.
Well, they knew I was coming. What happened, I think, at the time is going back to around 1993, maybe a little earlier, my court system, before I while I was a lawyer, and I wasn't part of this process, but there was, and you mentioned it as we were talking earlier. There was a very high-profile case of a young man named Winn. Aaron was going to be going off to college. He lived in a very loved with a high middle class family, and he got in a serious motorcycle accident and suffered traumatic brain injury. One thing led to another. His family was completely unable to get any treatment, any services, any rehabilitation, nothing. He ultimately got arrested and was confined to a state forensic hospital because he was not able to proceed to trial, and literally held and confined in solitary confinement for 2.5 years in 4 and 5 point restraints, which was literally tantamount to torture. As a matter of fact, his family ultimately sued the state of Florida for civil rights violations and did prevail. And now Aaron is safe. He's in a private hospital for individuals with head trauma. But the story goes that he was in one of our large grocery store chains in South Florida at the cashier, and he had been released from the forensic hospital. Still, his parents couldn't find any services or help for him, couldn't get him into a hospital. There were long waiting lists. He was at the cashier. He had some kind of a panic attack, darted out of the grocery store and collided with an 85-year-old woman who fell to the pavement and ultimately died of her head injuries sustained. And Aaron was now charged with murder. His public defender, who is our actual public defender now, he was an assistant public defender at the time, Howard Finkelstein, a very charismatic, talented lawyer, represented him. And when he came to meet Aaron's parents and they told him about this extraordinary plight, Howard really had this, there was this consciousness of awakening that his office was part of a problem. Just, the revolutions, the revolving door, or never really connecting the dots. And so he ultimately, after a task force was formed, there was a grand jury investigation of our community's mental health system in 1994. The court is an outgrowth of that. They really wanted to do something, not only to prevent what happened to Aaron, but to respond to all of the people that were in our local jail. And they had no money, no grants, nobody really knew what to do. And finally, really our leap of faith was Howard saying, I just want my own specialized court. And I knew I was coming with some specialized skills. And I think it was just like, our something that miraculously turned into an effective strategy, not only for Broward, but for the country and for courts around the world.
It's just remarkable. I mean, I go from goosebumps to tears to, the story, to think of anybody in our country being held in 4 and 5 point restraints in solitary confinement. I know. It's like war crimes torture. I just can't.
It is.
And his family,
it's interesting. Again, it is in the book, but his family was awarded $18 million, mostly in punitive damages, that is providing for Aaron's care. And so Aaron became what we call the unlikely savior for a new system
for so many
of
other
justice.
People. Yeah.
We had a shared vision among our community providers that we really wanted to help our family members. Our family members in our community were losing their adult children. They were becoming trapped, either trapped in the jail system, or they were endlessly going in and out from jails to emergency rooms, to the streets, back home, back to, I mean, it was just incredibly wasteful, and the suffering, of course, is immense. And so we really were looking to, together in this beautiful community collaborative. I mean, every agency needed to change their service models in order to support me and the court in getting people out of one inappropriate system, the jail, to a more humane and therapeutic system or environment, and that would be the healthcare system.
Well, I love your book. My eyes are too old to read it at the font it is. So but I think what I want to say here is one of the things you said is a primary goal of the court, and you're talking about this mental health court, is to promote dignity and the restoration of personhood.
Yeah.
I mean, those are not terms that we think of typically when we think of the judicial system. We think of stern, harsh, too many courtroom dramas where people are,
Judge Judy. I know.
Yeah, exactly. Or it's brilliant lawyers who are duking it out with each other while the, defendants or whatever are sitting there. But through your book, I hear the stories of compassion, that this court is designed to treat people with dignity and compassion and this restoration of personhood. So explain, just maybe for somebody who doesn't understand, what would that look like? Tell, even if it's through a particular real person or composite that you have had in your courtroom, what is it like? So a person is arrested for a crime, it's discovered that they have a mental illness, and then from there, what happens?
Exactly. So I just wanted to comment on one thing, and then I want to go into it, into that scenario. But just jumping back, because it's a very unique point that you raise, and it makes Barrett's Court, I think, still to this day unique. And that is that we recognize that there's the stigma, the discrimination, the marginalization, that there's so much humiliation and shame surrounding individuals with mental illness, that we wanted the courtroom to become a refuge. We wanted people to know that we were taking a court of law and we were literally turning it inside out, and that we wanted to serve them. How can we help you? We are here for you. And the idea of having a human rights strategy in a problem-solving court and being bold enough to be able to articulate that, I think is, not to me, but I just think it's stunning that humanizing the law helps people. It levels a playing field. It reduces anxiety. It builds trust. And I've always heard from every single individual mental health consumer that having one person, even one person that believes in you, that has an abiding belief in recovery, that you can get well, is everything. It's everything. And so, for example, we created an open referral system. We wanted to make it very simple because this is for our community. It's for our family members. And we don't really even get too into issues of diagnoses, this and that. I have a clinician handpicked from when I worked in the state hospital, embedded as part of the court team. All of our problem solving, screening, assessing is done right in the courtroom. We don't want somebody sitting in a jail cell for one more second than they absolutely have to. And so when they come to court, it's a welcome. It's a welcome. How could we help you? Miss Smith, Miss whoever, Johnson, welcome to Mental Health Court. I'm Judge Wren. Let me tell you a little bit about this court. And then I give a brief summary. It's a voluntary court, and it's for those that are interested in care. And the idea that we want to know, we understand about trauma. We were doing trauma-informed work 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And, talking about the ACE study and adverse childhood experiences and the impact for women, for men, but we know that particularly for justice-involved women, 85 to 90% of women have been subject to domestic violence, to abuse. So I think, for example, of one of the women in my book, Catherine, who came in. She literally had been a restaurant manager for 15 years. She bought a home. She bought a 5-bedroom home in the western part of the county, 3 children. One thing led to another. Her marriage began to deteriorate. She ran into financial hardship. Her mental health really began to deteriorate. And before you knew it, the story is she literally had a very negative encounter with her spouse. The spouse thought that her children were at risk. The children were taken away. Catherine felt that if she didn't have her children to care for, she didn't need her home anymore. She literally walked out of her home and to the streets and survived on the streets for 2.5 years until she got arrested for a minor charge of petty theft and ended up being referred to the mental health court. And it's an incredibly moving story because she'll to this day, I specifically had her permission to interview her for this book, and she would say, it was in the mental health court for the very first time that I realized I had lost everything.
Wow. Everything.
And she went into treatment. She was living in our homeless shelter, and before you knew it, went back to college. She's been an extraordinary community intensive case manager now with one of our largest mental health centers for the past 15 years.
That's just a story that blows my mind, because without the mental health court, she would have may or may not have been competent for to be even come before a judge and have her case heard, and then she would have been probably sent for jail time for that, and then released with her mental illness still untreated, right. And she would have gone back to the street, and her life would likely have continued that spiral.
Absolutely.
And that cycling between arrest and hospitalization or, homelessness. And so in the mental health court, you said it's voluntary.
It is.
So who qualifies then to be seen?
That's a great question. It's a misdemeanor court, and a misdemeanor in the state of Florida is any crime up to 1 year in jail. There are 2 offenses that are excluded: driving under the influence and domestic violence. I was not a party to the administrative order, so whatever rationale that was, that's the exclusion. I could hear battery cases with victims' consent, and so the design of the court really is to use the court structurally as a pathway from the jail system to linkages based on really wraparound services holistically based on individual needs. And the court has no standardized timelines. We really work with everybody on a highly individualized basis. And about 18 months after the court began, Congress passed legislation to pilot these courts through the United States, creating somewhat of a different model, but still, these courts, I think, have been very, very important in order to disrupt the criminalization trend, number one, bring attention to mental health and the need for investment in our community systems of care. And I think you would be extremely pleased to know that because of, my relationship with suicide prevention, I declared openly on purpose to communicate to the world that Broward's Mental Health Court is a zero suicide initiative.
Wow.
And what that means for us is that we talk about suicide prevention, suicide education out in the open. We break the silence, we break the taboo, we give out resources. We want all of our community in the world to know that suicide prevention has been elevated to a number one priority for this court.
Wow.
Powerful.
I had not heard that. That is news to me, but I'm thrilled about that. So if a family member has a loved one who's been arrested and they know that there's something wrong. I was interesting that you mentioned in your book that a pretty large percentage of people, the loved ones, don't necessarily know that their loved one has a mental illness. They just know there's something wrong with them. Something's wrong. And you said a large percentage of the people who appear in your court haven't been in treatment. Is that correct?
That's correct.
They're not even, it's not like they're failing treatment. They're not even in treatment.
Some have, a lot haven't. But I do think that the point that you're making is really a salient and important message and theme of the book. And that is that, our families need to understand what is mental health, what is mental illness, what do families do, where do they go, how do they get help. We should not have to wait for crisis. And so that treatment works. And I think that we spend so much time in the court educating, doing behavioral health literacy. I literally spend so much time, and I cherish it. Okay, because I want family members, mothers and fathers and sisters and extended family to be able to advocate, to be an advocacy voice. I just left this morning a hearing where I said to the family, to the parents, you have to get a notebook. You have to document everything, keep records. I want you to contact NAMI and be part of that network and get to the family to family course and become an expert, because you're going to need to be an expert in advocacy. Florida is literally 49th to 50th funded in the country. Wow.
So is there a way for a family member to advocate that their loved one be sent to the mental health court rather than, how would a family, maybe this is the first time that there's been an incarceration, how would they even know that is it available in every state? Is it, how does somebody access this for their loved one?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, for example, obviously, it's an old innovation in Broward. I think, everybody's on the lookout, other judges, probation officers, et cetera. But in other circuits around the country, I think it's very important for family members to contact their court administrative offices or their clerk's offices and simply ask, is there a mental health court, or their public defender's office? Is there a mental health court in our area that we could access? And, everybody will know that because it's a collaboration.
Are there reasons why, or what reasons have you heard through the years why someone might not choose to access it? Because I hear you describe it. I hear you talk about dignity. I hear you talk about recovery. I hear you talk about whole person diversion away from jail to, to rehabilitation. It sounds so beautiful. And yet not every person who is eligible will take this advantage. Why would somebody not take it? Why would somebody not choose to be a part?
I think that, if you can have the answer to that, Kay, I'd like to know it.
Okay, all right.
That's a complicated question that experts, we really struggle with that. And it has to do with so many factors. It has to do with stigma. It has to do with discrimination. It has to do with nobody believes it. It has to do with denial. It has to do with, just from a psychiatric rehabilitative vantage point, it has to do with readiness. People have to be ready. I guess we can say the same thing for people with substance use addiction, right? Mm-hmm. Some people just aren't ready to get into rehab and do the work. And it is work.
Yeah.
Recovery is work. So, I think there's a lot of different streams of barriers that people may or may not choose to gain access to care. But certainly, we always leave the door open for those, that don't want to. And I also want to clarify a very important point. And that is that if somebody comes to the courtroom and they are acutely ill, that there is a psychiatric emergency happening, we don't stop for a second and start getting into, do you want care? Do you not want to get care? If my clinician says we've got an emergency, then that's an emergency, and we will wait till the person stabilizes, returns to the court, and then we'll have that discussion as to how do you feel? How do you feel about participating in care? What's your attitude about it? Do you want to? Do you not? And if people don't want to, we make sure two things. They have information on where to get care. They have crisis information, correct? And I tell them you don't need to get arrested if you decide you want access to help and referrals. You could just walk into the courtroom and we're happy to help you.
Wow. You are doing such good work and making a difference. Well, thank you. But I love, in the mental health field, we're always looking for new approaches, new ways to break cycles. We talk about that there's a broken healthcare system, broken mental health care system. Part of it is because the jails are the predominant providers of mental health care. So this interplay between the justice system and mental illness is a major piece of a broken system. To see how the mental health courts have been designed to interrupt that or to remedy one of those places of brokenness is just so encouraging. And maybe the last thing I would say is just you have talked to so many people who, you mentioned Catherine, who is a success story, and your book is full of stories, mostly of people who have been able to find the help. There are a few people, you tell some of the stories that are heartbreaking, of people who, for whatever reason, don't access the help or don't find the recovery.
They may not have what they really, really, really need. It's true. We have very scarce, fragmented system of care, and that's true. It's true. It is heartbreaking. But I also want to say one last thing, because you mentioned something, and I thought that, your work is just so incredibly inspiring. And, faith-based institutions and this sector is so powerful. It's a gateway to mental health, and for, your people, your congregation and others to know how important, number one, it is, how to help us advocate for more services. Yeah. I really visualize a day when we won't need mental health courts. And that beautiful vision back in 1963 does in fact come to fruition. And that's really my vision.
Well, thank you so much for being with you. Readers, Judge Wren's book is A Court of Refuge, Stories from the Bench of America's.
I'll hold it up for you.
There we go, because mine will be backwards. There we go. It's a beautiful book. It's full of encouraging stories, particularly if you love someone who struggles with mental illnesses and in that cycle of homelessness or incarceration.
You're going to be encouraged.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank
Hope to
you.
see you
Thank you
soon.
very much. I'll see you soon.